The tallow candle sputters, casting long, trembling shadows against the stone. To speak of the year 1235 in the Abbey of St. Albans is not to recount a list of dates, but to inhale the scent of damp wool, cold incense, and the metallic tang of hidden iron. In those days, the silence of the cloister was not always a vessel for prayer. Sometimes, it was a shroud for things that refused to stay buried. Part 1. The weight of the tonsure. The stone does not forget. It absorbs the chanting of the monks, the salt of their sweat, and the quiet rhythm of sand falling through an hourglass. To Brother Thomas, the abbey had become a labyrinth of echoes. He walked the cloisters with his head bowed, not in piety, but because the sky felt too heavy to look at. In the medieval mind, a monastery was a microcosm of the celestial order, a fortress of light against the howling chaos of the world. But light, when concentrated through the prism of power, can burn. The Abbey of St. Albans sat upon the throat of the English countryside, a titan of land and law. Here, the boundary between the city of God and the city of man had worn thin, frayed by the friction of gold and the ambitions of men who wore hairshirts over hearts of flint. The fragrance of decay. Thomas spent his days in the scriptorium. The air there was a thick brew of parchment dust, gall ink, and the sharp vinegar smell of pigments. He was a master of the blue of ultramarine, a color more expensive than gold, ground from lapis lazuli carried across the sea. As he applied the blue to the robes of a painted Virgin Mary, his fingers trembled. Outside, the rain fell with a relentless, rhythmic thud, the sound of earth being packed onto a grave. Rumors had begun to circulate, as thin and cold as the winter mist. The abbot, a man named Roger whose eyes were like polished onyx, had been seen late at night in the treasury with messengers from the king's court. In the 13th century, a monk was supposed to be dead to the world. Yet the world had a way of reaching through the stone walls with its blood-stained fingers. Time is a river that flows only toward the abyss, Thomas thought, watching a drop of ink bloom in a jar of water. We call it progress when the river rises, and tragedy when it floods. But to the water there is no difference. It only seeks the lowest point. The sound of the bell. The matins bell rang at midnight. It was a sound that tore through sleep like a serrated blade. The monks shuffled into the choir, their robes hushing against the floor. A sound like dry leaves skittering in a graveyard. The air in the chapel was freezing. It smelled of extinguished beeswax and the ancient, earthy breath of the crypts below. As they sang the De Profundis. Out of the depths I cry to thee, O Lord. Thomas looked across the aisle. The seat of Brother Ethelred was empty. Ethelred had been the cellarer, the man who held the keys to the abbey's belly. He was a man of simple faith and complex ledgers. He had whispered to Thomas only 2 days prior about a discrepancy in the grain tithes, gold that was supposed to go to the poor but was instead flowing into the pockets of the Bishop of Lisieux to fund a private war in Normandy. Now, Ethelred's stall was a dark void in the candlelight. The theology of fear. In the Middle Ages, fear was not an emotion. It was a geography. One lived within the borders of fear, fear of the plague, fear of the Viking, fear of the devil. But the most suffocating fear was the one that wore a crucifix. When a man enters a monastery, he commits civil death. He surrenders his name, his property, and his will. He becomes a ghost in service to the eternal. But what happens when the ghost begins to bleed? What happens when the sanctuary becomes the slaughterhouse? Thomas felt the eyes of the abbot upon him. Abbot Roger stood at the high altar, his golden crozier reflecting the dim flame of the sanctuary lamp. The staff was a shepherd's tool, meant to hook the straying sheep. In Roger's hand, it looked like a weapon meant to crush the skull of any sheep that asked where the flock was being led. Freedom, Thomas realized, was a terrifying concept. To be free meant to be outside the wall, in the cold, unprotected by the institution. Inside the wall, there was bread and warmth, but the price was a slow strangulation of the soul. Is a bird in a golden cage free if the door is open but the sky is filled with hawks? The discovery. After the service, as the others retreated to the dorter, Thomas stayed behind. He claimed a penance, a need to scrub the stones of the Lady Chapel. He waited until the footsteps faded into silence. That heavy, absolute silence that only exists in places built to last 1,000 years. He moved toward the scriptorium, his small oil lamp casting a weak, amber circle on the floor. He didn't know what he was looking for until he reached Ethelred's desk. The wood was cold. On the floor, near the stool, was a small, dark stain. Thomas knelt. He touched it. It wasn't ink. It was tacky, thick, and smelled of iron and copper. At that moment, the wind shifted, rattling the leaded glass windows. In the flicker of his lamp, he saw the shadows of the pillars stretch out like the fingers of a giant. He realized then that the monastery was not a house of prayer. It was a counting house where the currency was human life. Faith is a bridge built over the unknown. But when the bridge is built by men who seek only to walk over others, the stone begins to crack. Thomas looked at the blood on his fingertip and felt a coldness that no hearth could ever warm. He was no longer a monk, he was a witness. And in the 13th century, a witness was merely a victim who hadn't been caught yet. In the medieval world, silence was considered the gateway to the soul, but in St. Albans, it had become a weapon. Every footfall in the corridor was a heartbeat. Every creak of a door was a gasp. As the season of Lent approached, the great fast, the atmosphere grew thin and brittle like old vellum. The litany of shadows. The next morning, the sun did not rise. It merely turned the fog into a bruised gray. The monks gathered for prime. The absence of Brother Ethelred was no longer a mystery to be whispered. It was a fact to be ignored. Abbot Roger stood before them, his face a mask of carved ivory. He announced that Ethelred had been called away on urgent diocesan business to the coast of Kent. The lie hung in the air, visible to anyone who dared to look, yet every head remained bowed. This was the true power of the institution. Not that it could convince men of a lie, but that it could compel them to act as if the lie were the only truth. What is a man's voice against the roar of the cathedral? Thomas mused, his quill scratching rhythmically in the scriptorium. We are told that the word was with God, but here the word is used to bury the deed. We build steeples to reach the heavens, yet we use the foundations to hide our sins. Perhaps God does not live in the heights, but in the cracks between the stones. The taste of ash. Lent brought a change in the sensory world of the abbey. The smell of roasting meat disappeared, replaced by the bitter, alkaline scent of lye used to scrub the floors and the thin, watery aroma of leek pottage. Hunger began to sharpen the monk's nerves. Thomas found himself assigned to the infirmary to help the herbalist, Brother Julian. Julian was a man whose hands were permanently stained yellow by turmeric and green by nightshade. He was older than the stones themselves, his eyes clouded by cataracts that made him look as if he were constantly peering into another realm. The earth provides the cure, and the earth provides the end, Julian whispered as they crushed dried henbane. The sound of the mortar and pestle was like teeth grinding in the dark. Julian leaned closer, his breath smelling of stale mint. Ethelred did not go to Kent, Thomas. The cellar's keys were found in the well. But the well is deep, and the water is cold. Some things are better left at the bottom. The theology of the void. Death, in the 13th century, was a constant companion. It sat at the table. It slept in the hay. But there was a difference between a good death, confessed, anointed and mourned, and the disappearance. To disappear was to be erased from the book of life, to have one's memory stripped away before the body was even cold. Thomas began to feel the isolation of the observant. He saw the way the prior, a man with a nervous twitch in his eye, avoided the scriptorium. He saw the way the younger novices huddled together, their eyes darting like trapped birds. The abbey was no longer a community. It was a collection of solitudes, each man a prisoner of his own suspicion. He thought about the nature of time. To the church, time was a circle, the liturgical year repeating until the second coming. But to Thomas, time now felt like a narrowing spiral. Every hour spent in the shadow of the abbot was a turn inward, toward a center that was hollow and dark. The cloister's breath. One night, unable to sleep, Thomas walked to the cloisters. The moonlight turned the central garden into a silver graveyard. The air was sharp with the scent of frozen earth and the distant smoke of the town's hearths. He heard a sound, a rhythmic, wet thud coming from the direction of the chapter house. He moved through the shadows, his breathing shallow. Through a narrow lancet window he saw figures. Not monks in prayer, but men in the heavy, salt-stained cloaks of soldiers. They were moving crates, heavy, iron-bound chests that bore the seal of the crown. And there, standing among them, was Abbot Roger. He was holding a ledger, Ethelred's ledger. The abbot took a candle and held it to a page. Thomas watched as the record of the grain tithes, the evidence of the stolen gold, shriveled into black ash. The smell of burning parchment wafted through the window. A sweet, sickly smell, like the skin of a summer fruit left to rot. It was the smell of history being rewritten, the weight of the secret. To know the truth is to carry a cross that no one can see. Thomas realized that Ethelred hadn't just discovered a theft. He had discovered a bridge. The abbey was funding a coup, a silent war between the king's brothers, and the souls of the monks were being traded for political leverage. The tragedy of the medieval soul was its total dependence on the very structures that betrayed it. If Thomas spoke, he would be a heretic. If he stayed silent, he was a collaborator. He looked up at the stars, those cold, indifferent lanterns. They had seen the rise and fall of Rome. They would see the stones of St. Albans turn to dust. Faith is not the absence of doubt, he whispered into the cold night. It is the courage to hold the light even when you realize the temple is a tomb. As he turned to leave, he stepped on a dry twig. The snap was like a bone breaking in the silence. Inside the chapter house, the abbot's head turned. The onyx eyes searched the darkness, and for a heartbeat, the predator and the prey shared the same air. By morning, the atmosphere of St. Albans had shifted from suspicion to a calculated, sterile dread. The abbot did not call for an investigation. Instead, he called for a cleansing of the spirit. In the medieval mind, the body was a rebellious beast that needed to be tamed. The abbot simply used this theology to break the wills of those who saw too much. The trial of the senses. The fast was intensified. The monks were forbidden from speaking even in the designated hours. The scriptorium, once Thomas's sanctuary, became a place of penance. The abbot ordered that all secular colors, the vibrant blues, the rich cinnabars, be locked away. Only black ink and plain vellum were permitted. Our work must reflect the gravity of the soul, the abbot declared, his voice smooth as polished marble. The room now smelled of cold iron and the acrid smoke of low-quality tallow. Thomas sat at his bench, his hands cramping. Without the ultramarine, he felt as though he were losing his sight. To strip a painter of color is to strip a priest of his liturgy. It was a slow, psychological flaying. What is freedom but the ability to see the world in its true hues? Thomas scribbled in the margin of a ledger, only to scratch it out immediately. If the sky is made gray by decree, does the blue cease to exist, or does it merely retreat into the heart? Perhaps God is the only one who truly sees, and we are merely blind men arguing over the shape of the sun. The confessional trap. The isolation was the hardest to bear. In the silence, the mind turns upon itself. Thomas found himself listening to the sounds of the abbey with a frantic intensity. The rhythmic thump-thump of the laundry, the distant lowing of cattle, the sharp, metallic clang of the blacksmith's hammer. Each sound felt like a clock ticking toward an inevitable conclusion. One afternoon, Thomas was summoned to the abbot's private solar. The room was a stark contrast to the rest of the monastery. It smelled of expensive beeswax, dried lavender, and something sharp, cloves perhaps, used to mask the scent of old age and power. Abbot Roger sat behind a desk of heavy oak. He did not look up from his papers for a long time. The only sound was the crackle of the hearth, a luxury the common monks were denied. "Brother Thomas," the abbot finally said, his voice a low hum, "your work on the Virgin's robe was exceptional. Such a pity that the world is too dark to appreciate such brilliance." He looked up then, and Thomas saw the predatory stillness in his gaze. The cellarer, Ethelred, was a man of many ledgers. He was also a man of many secrets. He lacked the strength to carry them. I hope you are stronger, Thomas. The philosophy of the wall. The abbot began to speak of the Great Wall. Not the physical stones of the abbey, but the wall of the faith. He argued that for the church to survive in a world of warring kings and grasping lords, it had to become a fortress. And a fortress, he whispered, requires secrets to keep its foundations dry. Is a lie truly a sin if it preserves the sanctuary? Roger asked, leaning into the firelight. Thomas felt a cold sweat prickle his scalp. He realized the abbot wasn't looking for a confession. He was looking for an accomplice. He wanted Thomas to understand that the blood on the scriptorium floor was a necessary sacrifice for the greater peace. We are told that the truth shall set us free, Thomas thought as he walked back to his cell, the taste of ash in his mouth. But in this world, the truth is a millstone. It sinks the man who carries it. Real freedom, it seems, is the luxury of those who know nothing at all. The sound of the river. That night, Thomas returned to the herb garden. He found Brother Julian sitting by the small stream that ran beneath the abbey walls. The water was black and moved with a heavy, oily consistency. They are moving the gold tonight, Julian whispered, his cataracts catching the moonlight like two clouded pearls. The king's men, they leave through the water gate. Ethelred tried to stop them with a cross. He found out that iron is heavier than wood. Julian reached into his sleeve and pulled out a small, dried root. This is belladonna. In small doses, it brings sleep. In large doses, it brings the end of all questions. The abbot has asked for a tonic for his restless nights. He wants me to give it to you first, Thomas, to test its strength. The betrayal was complete. The sanctuary had become a snare. The very medicine meant to heal was being prepared as a shroud. The bitter beauty. Thomas looked at the belladonna root. It was gnarled and ugly, yet it held the power to stop the wheels of a conspiracy. He realized that the abbot's power relied entirely on the monk's fear of death. If one no longer feared the end, the abbot had no tools left. As he stood by the dark water, Thomas felt a strange, hollow peace. The world was a place of mud and blood, of stolen gold and buried ledgers. But the water still flowed. The stars still burned. The beauty of the world remained, indifferent to the sins of men. I will not drink it, Julian, Thomas said softly. Then you must run, the old man replied. But where does a ghost go when the graveyard is locked? Thomas looked at the high, spiked walls of St. Albans. He knew there was no escape, not in the way men usually meant. But as he watched the water disappear into the darkness under the gate, he understood that there was a different kind of exit, one that required a final, poetic act of defiance. The scriptorium was a tomb of silence, but for Thomas, it was now a battlefield. The abbot had commissioned a grand Bible, a gift for the king to seal their dark covenant. It was to be a masterpiece of black and gold, austere, heavy, and silent. But Thomas, tasked with the final flourishes, saw it as his only vessel. The alchemy of truth. The scent of the room had changed. The sweet, floral notes of the pigments were gone, replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of the black gall ink and the dry, dead smell of scraped animal skin. Thomas worked by a single, dying candle. The flame danced in the draught, casting his shadow against the wall like a giant, hunched crow. He did not paint the saints in their usual glory. Instead, in the tiny, microscopic borders of the capital letters, he began to weave a different story. With a brush made of a single squirrel hair, he painted the cellarer's keys sinking into the well. He painted the iron chests of the king's men. He painted the abbot's face, not as a shepherd, but as a wolf wearing a mitre. It was the gospel of the margins. The truth hidden where only the most observant or the most guilty would find it. What is a book but a frozen thought? Thomas whispered, his eyes aching from the strain. Men burn bodies to hide the truth, but they preserve books. They think the ink is dead, but it is a seed. It waits for a different sun, a different century, to bloom. To write is to gamble with the ghost of the future. The weight of the atmosphere. The air in the abbey felt thick, as if the stones were exhaling the humidity of centuries. The sound of the monks chanting in the distance, Miserere me, Deus, felt hollow. It was no longer a plea for mercy. It was a drone of exhaustion. Thomas felt a strange, detached empathy for his brothers. They moved like ghosts through the cloisters, their identities eroded by the grinding stone of the rule. They were men who had come seeking God and found only a bureaucracy of the soul. He thought of freedom again. Not the freedom to leave, for the world outside was just a larger cage of hunger and war, but the freedom of the inner eye. Even as his body was trapped within the walls, his hand was moving across the parchment, recording a reality that the abbot could not touch without destroying his own prestige. The shadow in the doorway. A shadow fell across his desk. It wasn't the abbot. It was Brother Julian, the herbalist. His hands were shaking, and the smell of nightshade followed him like a shroud. "They have moved the trial to the dawn," Julian whispered. "Not a trial of law, Thomas. A trial of health. The abbot has told the prior that you have fallen under a melancholic fever, that you are a danger to yourself." In the Middle Ages, madness was often seen as a spiritual failure. To declare a man melancholic was to strip him of his voice before he even spoke. It was a clean, bloodless execution of the reputation. "Take this," Julian said, pressing a small vial of blue glass into Thomas's hand. "It is not the poison he requested. It is a tincture of poppy and mandrake. It will not kill, but it will make you appear dead to the touch. The heart will slow to a faint thrum, like a bee in winter. They will carry you to the crypts. From there, perhaps the earth will be kinder than the altar." The choice of the spirit. Thomas looked at the vial. The liquid inside was dark and viscous, reflecting the candlelight like a dragon's eye. To take the draught was to descend into the underworld, to trust the darkness. To refuse was to face the cleansing of the abbot, which would surely end in a more permanent silence. He looked back at the king's Bible. He had just finished a small illumination in the corner of the Book of Job. It depicted a single, blue feather falling through a void. It was his signature. A fragment of the color he had been forbidden to use, ground from a tiny piece of lapis lazuli he had hidden under his fingernail. The bitter peace. The tragedy of faith is often found in its solitude. Thomas realized that he could not save the abbey. He could not stop the king's war. He was a small man in a vast cold machine. But as he felt the cool glass of the vial against his palm, he felt a flicker of grim joy. The abbot thought he was a master of the silence, but Thomas had turned the silence into a record. The book would go to the king's court. It would be handled by scholars, by queens, by nervous scribes. One day, a pair of eyes would wander from the holy text to the profane margins. The secret would wait, patient as stone. "Go, Julian," Thomas said softly. "The night is almost over." As the herbalist disappeared into the dark, Thomas sat for a moment longer. He listened to the rain, the same rain that had washed Ethelred's blood into the soil. He realized that time was not a circle, nor a line, but a labyrinth. And sometimes the only way out is to go deeper into the dark. In the medieval mind, the crypt was not merely a cellar for the dead. It was the womb of the church, the heavy, silent foundation upon which the hymns of the living rested. To be sent there was to be returned to the earth while the soul still flickered. The draught of Lethe. Thomas looked at the blue glass vial. The liquid inside felt heavy, as if it contained the weight of the shadows themselves. He knew that Julian's concoction was a gamble with the void. To mimic death is to invite it to stay. He swallowed the tincture. It tasted of bitter almonds and the coldness of a grave. Almost instantly, the world began to blur at the edges. The smell of the ink softened into the scent of distant forests. The sound of the wind through the lancet windows became a low, melodic hum. His heart, once a frantic bird beating against the cage of his ribs, slowed its tempo, matching the ancient, tectonic rhythm of the stone walls. What is the difference between sleep and the end? His mind drifted as he collapsed onto the rushes of the floor. Perhaps death is only the moment when the observer finally merges with the thing observed. We spend our lives looking at the world through a glass, darkly. Now the glass begins to shatter. The procession of the false mourners. When they found him, the abbot did not display shock. He displayed a practiced, funereal grace. He knelt by Thomas's cooling body, his fingers pressing into the neck, where the pulse had retreated into the deepest recesses of the flesh. The monks were gathered. The air was thick with the scent of thieves' oil, a pungent blend of cloves and lemon used to ward off the miasma of disease. They believed the melancholy had finally claimed the artist. There was no weeping. In St. Albans, tears had become a luxury that no one could afford to spend. They carried him on a wooden pallet down the spiral stairs, where the air turned sharp with the smell of saltpeter and ancient dust. The sound of their chanting, In Paradisum Degicant te Angeli, echoed off the low, vaulted ceilings, sounding more like a threat than a blessing. The geography of the dark. They placed him on a stone slab in the deepest reach of the ossuary, a place where the bones of forgotten monks were stacked like cordwood. The abbot stayed for a moment after the others left. The light of his single candle caught the gold embroidery on his sleeve, the gold bought with Ethelred's silence. "You were a beautiful instrument, Thomas," the abbot whispered, his voice a dry rasp in the dark. "But an instrument that plays its own tune is of no use to the master." The heavy iron door groaned shut. The click of the lock was the loudest sound Thomas had ever heard, even in his stupor. Then, the silence returned, absolute, heavy, and suffocating. The liminal state, hours or perhaps centuries passed. Thomas existed in a state of suspended animation. He could feel the cold of the stone leaching into his skin, but he could not move a finger. He was a prisoner in a suit of flesh. He began to hallucinate. He saw the blue of the ultramarine he had lost, pouring over the walls like a celestial tide. He saw Ethelred standing in the corner, his mouth filled with the grain of the tithes he had tried to protect. In this darkness, the concept of power seemed absurd. The king, the abbot, the gold. They were all flickering candles in a hurricane. Only the stone and the silence were real. Time is not a river, he realized in the depths of his trance. It is a mountain. We climb it, gasping for air, thinking we are going somewhere. But the mountain does not care. Our lives are just the moss that grows on its north side for a season. The awakening. Slowly, agonizingly, the warmth began to return to his extremities. It felt like needles of fire piercing his skin. His lungs, which had been taking shallow, ghostly sips of air, suddenly demanded a full breath. He gasped, the sound echoing harshly against the stacks of skulls. The air in the crypt was dead, but he was alive. He sat up, his limbs stiff as rusted hinges. Around him, the white gleam of bone caught the faint, impossible light that seemed to leak from the very stones. He realized then that Julian had given him more than a way out. He had given him a perspective. To have been dead and returned is to lose the ability to be afraid. He stood, leaning against the damp wall. He heard a sound, a faint, rhythmic scraping from above. It was the sound of the great Bible being packed into its lead-lined chest, ready to be sent to the king. The record of the crime was leaving the nest. Thomas smiled, a ghost-like expression in the dark. The abbot thought he had buried the witness, but he had only planted the seed deeper into the earth. The air in the ossuary was stagnant, smelling of saltpeter and the sweet, heavy scent of damp earth. Thomas moved by touch, his fingers tracing the rough-hewn flint of the foundation. He knew these stones. He had spent years studying the geometry of the abbey to understand how light would hit the altar. Now he used that knowledge to find the shadow's exit, the geography of escape. In the medieval architectural mind, every great structure required a breath, a series of narrow ventilation shafts to keep the foundations from rotting. Thomas found the opening behind a stack of weathered coffins. It was a vertical slit, barely wider than a man's shoulders, smelling of the night air and distant rain. As he climbed, his fingernails bleeding against the lime mortar, he felt the true meaning of penance. Every inch was a struggle against the gravity of his own past. We spend our lives building walls to keep the world out, he thought, his breath coming in ragged gasps, only to realize that the most dangerous thing was always inside with us. Power is a fortress that eventually becomes a tomb for those who hold it. True freedom is not having a key, but realizing that the walls are an illusion. The final witness. He emerged into the herb garden, a shadow among shadows. The abbey was silent, save for the rhythmic tolling of the bell for the office of the dead. His own death. From the cover of a thick yew tree, Thomas watched the main courtyard. The king's messengers were mounting their horses. The great lead-lined chest containing the Bible, the Gospel of the Margins, was being strapped to a packhorse. Abbot Roger stood on the steps, his hands folded in his sleeves, a picture of divine contentment. He believed the secret was buried in the crypt. He did not see the pair of eyes watching him from the darkness of the garden. He did not know that the very book he was sending to the king as a tribute was, in fact, a ticking clock that would eventually unravel his legacy. The philosophy of the trace. Thomas did not try to kill the abbot. He did not cry out for justice. He understood now that human justice is a flickering candle, easily blown out by the winds of politics. But the trace, the mark left on the world, is eternal. He slipped through the small water gate, the same one where Ethelred's body had been cast. The water of the river Ver was icy, clutching at his legs like cold hands. As he waded across, leaving the walls of St. Albans behind, he felt the heavy weight of the tonsure lift from his spirit. He was no longer a monk, no longer a painter, no longer a victim. He was the wind, the bitter beauty of the end. Years later, history would record a scandal at the court of King Henry. It was said that a young clerk, while illuminating a royal decree, discovered strange, blasphemous drawings in the margins of the St. Albans Bible, drawings of gold theft, of a cellarous murder, and of a wolf in an abbot's mitre. The investigation that followed would be the abbot's undoing, though Thomas would not be there to see it. Thomas spent his remaining days as a wanderer, a nameless laborer in the vineyards of France. He never picked up a brush again. He had realized that the most beautiful color in the world was not the blue of ultramarine, but the gray of a morning mist when one is free to walk through it. He died in a hayloft near Lisieux, with no one to sing his requiem. But as his eyes closed for the final time, he didn't see the darkness of the crypt. He saw a single blue feather falling through an infinite void, a mark of beauty that no king could command and no abbot could bury. The stone does not forget, but the soul, once it has paid its debt to the dark, finally learns how to fly.
Like and subscribe to this channel for more interesting stories.